Chapter 3 of XYZ, a Detective Story, by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 3 An Unexpected Calamity. 5 minutes passed, during which I threaded more laughing groups and sauntered down more mysterious passageways than I would care to count. Still, the mysterious black domino glided on before me, leading me from door to door till my patience was nearly exhausted, and I had well nigh determined to give him the slip and make my way at once to the garden and the no doubt by this time highly impatient Joe. But before I had the opportunity of carrying out this scheme, the ominous black domino paused, and carelessly pointing to a door at the termination of a narrow corridor, bowed, and hastily withdrew. "Now," said I, as soon as I found myself alone, "shall I proceed with this farce, or shall I end it? To go on means to interview Mr. Benson, acquaint him with what has come to my knowledge during the last half hour in which I have so successfully personified his son, and by these means perhaps awake him to the truth concerning this serious matter of Joseph's innocence or Hartley's guilt; while to stop now implies nothing more nor less than a full explanation with his son, a man of whose character and disposition I know little or nothing. Either alternative presented infinite difficulties, but of the two the former seemed to me more feasible and less embarrassing. At all events, in talking to Mr. Benson, I should not have the sensibilities of a lover to contend with, and however unfortunate in its results, our interview would be, at the mercy of old blood instead of young, a point always to be considered in a case where one's presumption has been carried beyond the bounds of decorum. Unlocking the door, I stepped, as I had been told I should, into a small room adjoining the library. All around me were books. Even the door by which I had entered was laden with them, so that when it was closed, all vestige of the door itself disappeared. Across the opening into the small library stood a screen, and it was not until I had pushed this somewhat aside that I was able to look into that room. My first glance assured me it was empty. Stark and bare of any occupant, the high-backed chairs loomed in the funereal gloom, while on the table, toward which I inadvertently glanced, stood a decanter with a solitary wine-glass at its side. Instantly I remembered what had been told me concerning that glass, and stepping forward, I took it up and looked at it. Immediately I heard, or thought I heard, an exclamation uttered somewhere near me, but upon glancing up and down the room and perceiving no one, I concluded I was mistaken, and deliberately proceeded to examine the wine-glass and assure myself that no wine had as yet been poured upon the powder I found in it. Satisfied at last that Mr. Benson had not yet taken his usual evening potion, I put the glass back and withdrew again to my retreat. I do not think another minute could have elapsed before I heard a step in the room behind me. A door leading into an adjoining apartment had been opened, and Mr. Benson had come in. He passed immediately to the table, poured out the wine upon the powder, and drank it off without a moment's hesitation. I heard him sigh as he put down the glass. With a turn of my hand I slipped off both domino and mask, and prepared to announce my presence by tapping on the lintel of the door beside which I stood. But a sudden change in Mr. Benson's lofty figure startled me. He was swaying, and the arms which had fallen to his side were moving with a convulsive action that greatly alarmed me. But almost instantly he recovered himself, and paced with a steady step toward the hall door, which at that moment resounded with a short loud knock. "Who's there?" he asked, with every appearance of his usual sternness. "Hartley," was the reply. "Are you alone?" the old gentleman again queried, making a move as if to unlock the door. "Carrie is with me, no one else," came in smothered accents from without. Mr. Benson at once turned the key, but no sooner had he done so than he staggered back. For an instant or two of horror he stood oscillating from side to side, then his frame succumbed, and the terrified eyes of his children beheld his white head lying low, all movement and appearance of life gone from the form that had but a moment before towered so proudly before them. With a shriek the daughter flung herself down at his side, and even the cheek of Hartley Benson grew white as he leaned over his father's already inanimate body. "He's dead!" came in a wild cry from her lips. "See, he does not breathe! Oh, Hartley, what could have happened? Do you think that Joe—" "Hush!" he exclaimed, with a furtive glance around him. "He may be here. Let me look. If Joe has done this—" He did not continue, but rose, and with a rapid tread began to cross the floor in my direction. In a flash I realized my situation. To be found by him now, without a domino, and in the position of listener, would be anything but desirable. But I knew of no way of escape, or so for the moment it seemed. But great emergencies call forth sudden resources. In the quick look I inadvertently threw around me, I observed that the portière hanging between me and the library was gathered at one side in very heavy folds. If I could hide behind them perhaps I might elude the casual glance he would probably cast into my place of concealment. At all events it was worth trying, and at the thought I glided behind the curtain. I was not disappointed in my calculations. Arrived at the door, he looked in, perceived the domino lying in a heap on the floor, and immediately drew back with an exclamation of undoubted satisfaction. "He's gone," said he, crossing back to his sister's side. Then in a tone of mingled irony and bitterness, hard to describe, cried aloud with a glance toward the open door, "He has first killed his father and then fled. Fool that I was to think he could be trusted." A horrified "Hartley!" burst from his sister's lips, and a suppressed but equally vehement "Villain!" from mine. But neither of us had time for more, for almost at the same instant the room filled with frightened guests, among which I discerned the face and form of the old servant Jonas, and the flowing robes and the white garments of Uncle Joe and the graceful Edith. To describe the confusion that followed would be beyond my powers, especially as my attention was at that time not so much directed to the effect produced by this catastrophe as to the man whom, from the moment Mr. Benson fell to the floor, I regarded as my lawful prey. He did not quake and lose his presence of mind in this terrible crisis. He was gifted with too much self-control to betray any unseemly agitation even over such a matter as his father's sudden death. Once only did I detect his lip tremble, and that was when an elderly gentleman, presumably a doctor, exclaimed after a careful examination of the fallen man, "This is no case of apoplexy, gentlemen." Then indeed Mr. Hartley Benson shivered, and betrayed an emotion for which I considered myself as receiving a due explanation when, a few minutes later, I observed the same gentleman lay his hand upon the decanter and glass that stood on the table, and after raising them one after the other to his nose, slowly shake his head, and with a furtive look around him, lock them both in a small cupboard that opened over the mantelpiece. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of XYZ, a detective story by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 4. In the Library. Mr. Benson was really dead. The fact being announced, most of the guests withdrew. In 10 minutes after he fell, the room was comparatively clear. Only the various members of the family, together with the gentleman I have already mentioned, remained behind. and even of these the two ladies were absent, they having followed the body into the adjoining room, where it had been reverently carried by the attached Jonas and another servant whose face I did not see. A most unlooked-for catastrophe burst from the lips of Uncle Joe. "Did you ever suspect he was a victim to heart disease?" he now asked, this time with looks directed toward the doctor. "No," came from that gentleman in a short, sharp way, which made Hartley Benson's pale face flush, though his eye did not waver from its steady solemn look toward the door through which his father's form had just been carried. "Mr. Benson was sound through and through a month ago. I know, because I examined him previous to his making his will. There was no heart disease then. That I am ready to take my oath upon." Hartley Benson's rigid look unfastened itself from the door and turned slowly toward the sombre face of the speaker, while Uncle Joe, with an increased expression of distress, looked slowly around as if he half hoped, half feared to behold his favorite nephew advance upon them from some shadowy corner. "My father consulted you, then?" said the former, in his slow, reserved way. "Did not that evince some suspicion of disease on his part?" "Possibly. A man in a despondent frame of mind will often imagine he has some deadly complaint or other. But he was quite sound, too sound, he seemed to think. Your father was not a happy man, Mr. Benson." There was meaning in the tone, and I was not surprised to observe Hartley draw back. "Why?" said he. "Do you think—" "I think nothing," broke in the doctor. "Only," and here he brought down his hand vigorously upon the table, "there has been prussic acid in the glass from which Mr. Benson drank this evening. The smell of bitter almonds is not to be mistaken." An interval of silent horror followed this announcement. Then a vehement "Great Heaven!" broke from the lips of Uncle Joe, while Hartley Benson, growing more and more rigid in his bearing, fixed his eyes on the doctor's face and barely ejaculated, "Poison!" "I say this," continued the doctor, too intent upon his own theory to notice either the growth of a terrible fear on the face of Uncle Joe, or the equally remarkable expression of subdued expectation on that of the son, "because long experience has taught me the uselessness of trying to hide such a fact as suicide, and also because, being the coroner of the county, it is my duty to warn you that an investigation will have to take place which will require certain precautions on my part, such as the sealing up of his papers, etc." "That is true," came from the lips of both brother and son, over whom a visible change had passed at the word suicide. "But I cannot think," the former began in an agitated voice. "That my father would do such a deed," interposed the latter. "It does not seem probable, and yet he was a very wretched man, and grief will often drive the best of us to despair." Uncle Joe gave his nephew a strange look, but said no more. The doctor went quietly on. "I do not know what your father's troubles were, but that he committed suicide I greatly fear, unless it can be proved the acid was taken by mistake, a conclusion which does not seem probable, for from the smell of the decanter it is evident the acid was mixed with the wine, in which I now remember advising him to take the nightly powder I prescribed to him for quite a trivial disorder a few days ago. The only thing that puzzles me is, why, if he meditated death, he should have troubled himself to take this powder. And yet, it is certain he did take it, for there is still some of the sediment of it remaining in the bottom of the glass." "He took the powder because it was already in the glass," broke in Hartley, in a heavy tone of voice. "My sister put it there before she went upstairs to dress. I think she was afraid he would forget it. My father was very careless about small matters." "He was careful enough not to poison any one else in the family," quoth the doctor. "There was scarcely a drop left in the decanter. He took the whole dose." "I beg your pardon, sirs, but is it suicide you are talking about?" cried a voice suddenly over their shoulders, making them all start. Jonas, the servant, had entered from the inner room, and, unseen by all but myself, had been listening to the last few words as if his life depended upon what they had to say. "If it is, why, I have a bit of an observation of my own to make that may help you to settle the matter." "You? What have you to say?" quoth the doctor, turning in surprise at the confident tone of voice in which the man spoke. "Not much, I am sure," cried Hartley, to whom the appearance at that moment of his father's old servant was evidently most unwelcome. "That is for you to judge, gentlemen. I can only tell you what I've seen, and that not 10 minutes ago. Mr. Hartley, do you mind the man in the yellow dress that was flitting about the parlors all the evening?" "Good heavens!" burst in uncontrollable agitation from Uncle Joe, and he caught his nephew by the arm with a look that called back the old rigid expression to the latter's face. "Yes," was the quiet reply. "I remember seeing such a person." "Well, sirs, I don't know as you will think anything of it, but a little while ago I was walking up and down the balcony outside there, when I happened to look into this room, and I saw that man in the yellow dress leaning over this very table, looking at the wineglass Miss Carrie had put there for master. He had it in his hand, and his head was down very close to it. But what he did to it or to the decanter either, I am sure, sirs, I don't know, for I was that frightened at seeing this spectre in the room master had kept locked all day, that I just slipped off the balcony and ran round the house to find Mr. Hartley. But you wasn't in the parlors, sir, nor Miss Carrie neither, and when I got to this room, there was master lying dead on the floor, and everybody crowding around him horror struck." Ejaculated the doctor, looking at Uncle Joe, who had sunk in a heap into the armchair his nephew abstractedly pushed toward him. "You see, sirs," Jonas resumed, with great earnestness, "Mr. Benson, for some reason or other, had been very particular about keeping his own room to-day. The library door was locked as early as 6 this morning, and he would let no one in without first asking who was there. That's why I felt so dumbfoundered at seeing this yellow man in the room. Besides—" But no sooner had the good man arrived at this point than he stopped, with a gasp, and after a quick look at Hartley, flushed, and drew back in a state of great agitation and embarrassment. Evidently a suspicion had just crossed the mind of this old and attached servant, as to whom the yellow domino might be. "Well, well," cried the doctor, "go on, let us hear the rest." I have nothing more to say," mumbled the man, while Hartley, with an equal display of embarrassment, motioned the discomfited servant to withdraw, and turned as if to hide his face over some papers on the table. "I think the man in the yellow domino had better be found," quoth the physician, dryly, glancing from Hartley to the departing form of the servant with a sharp look. "At all events, it would be well enough for us to know who he is." "I don't see—" began Uncle Joe, but stopped as he perceived the face of Hartley Benson slowly composing itself. Evidently he was as much interested as myself in observing what this not easily to be understood man would say and do in this sudden crisis. We were not long left in doubt. "Doctor," he began, in a slow, hesitating tone, well calculated to produce the effect he desired, "we unfortunately already know who wore a yellow domino this evening. My brother Joe—" "Hush!" implored his uncle, laying a hand on his nephew's arm with a quick look of distress not lost on the doctor. "Brother?" repeated the latter. "Pardon me, I did not know. Ah, but I do remember now to have heard that Mr. Benson had another son." The face of Hartley grew graver and graver. "My brother has been alienated from my father for some time. So you have never seen him here?" but to-night he hoped, or made me think he hoped, to effect a reconciliation. So I managed, with my sister, to provide him with the domino necessary to ensure him an entrance here. Indeed, I did more. I showed him a private door by which he could find his way into the library, never suspecting any harm could come from son and father meeting even in this surreptitious way. I loved my brother, and notwithstanding the past, had confidence in him. Nor can I think now he had anything to do with the— Here the voice of this inimitable actor broke in well-simulated distress. He sank on a chair and put his hands before his face. The doctor had no reason to doubt this man. He therefore surveyed him with a look of grave regard. "Mr. Benson," said he, "you have my profoundest sympathy. A tragedy like this in a family of such eminent respectability is enough to overwhelm the stoutest heart. If your brother is here—" "Dr. Travis," broke in the other, rising and grasping the physician's hand with an appearance of manly impulse impressive in one usually so stern and self-contained. "You are, or were, my father's friend. Can you or will you be ours? Dreadful as it is to think, my father undoubtedly committed suicide. He had a great dread of this day. It is the anniversary of an occurrence harrowing for him to remember. My brother—you see I shall have to break the secrecy of years—was detected by him in the act of robbing his desk 3 years ago to-night, and upon each and every recurrence of the day has returned to his father's house to beg for the forgiveness and restoration to favor which he lost by that deed of crime. Hitherto my father has been able to escape his importunities by absence or the address of his servants, but to-day he seemed to have a premonition that his children were in league against him, notwithstanding Carrie's ruse of the ball, and the knowledge may have worked upon him to that extent that he preferred death to a sight of the son that had ruined his life and made him the hermit you have seen. The doctor fell into the trap laid for him with such diabolical art. Perhaps. But if that is so, why is your brother not here? Only a few minutes could have elapsed between the time that Jonas saw him leaning over the table with a glass in his hand, and the moment when you and your sister entered this room, in face of your father's falling form. He must have been present, therefore, when your father came from his bedroom, if not when he drank the fatal glass. Why, then, did he take such pains to escape, if actuated by no keener emotion than horror at a father's suicide? I don't know, I cannot say, but that he himself put the poison in the decanter I will not believe. A thief is not necessarily a parricide. Even if he were in great straits and needed the money my father's will undoubtedly leaves him, he would think twice before he ran the risk of making Carrie and myself his natural enemies. No, no, if my father has died from poison, it was through a mistake, or by the administration of his own hand, never by that of Joe Benson's. Ah, and has anybody here present dared to charge him with such a deed? With a start both gentlemen turned. An accusing spirit stood before them. "Edith," broke from Hartley's lips, "this is no place for you. Go back, go back." "My place is where the name of Joseph Benson is uttered," she proudly answered, "whether the words be for good or evil. I am his betrothed wife, as you know, and again I ask, who has dared to utter an insinuation, however light, that he, the tender son and generous brother, has had a criminal hand in his father's awful death?" "No one, no one," essayed Hartley, taking her hand with a weak attempt at soothing. "I was but saying—" But she turned from him with a gesture of repugnance, and taking a step toward the doctor, looked him entreatingly in the face. You have not been expressing doubts of Mr. Benson's youngest son because he happened to wear a disguise and be present when Mr. Benson fell. You do not know Joe, sir. Nobody in this town knows him. His own father was ignorant of his worth, but we know him, Uncle Joe and I, and we know he could never do a deed that would stamp him either as a dishonorable or a criminal man. If Mr. Benson has died from poison, I should as soon think this man had a hand in it as his poor exiled brother." And in a burst of uncontrollable wrath and indignation, she pointed, with a sudden gesture, at the startled Hartley. But that worthy, though evidently taken aback, was not to be caught so easily. "Edith, you forget yourself," said he, with a studied self-possession. "The horrors of this dreadful occurrence have upset you. I do not wonder at it myself, but the doctor will not so readily understand you. Miss Underhill has been strangely attached to my brother," he went on, turning to the latter with an apologetic smile that made Uncle Joe grind his teeth in silent wrath. "They were engaged previously to the affair of which I have just made mention, and naturally she could never bring herself to consider him guilty of a crime which, once acknowledged, must necessarily act as a bar of separation between them. She calls him a martyr, a victim, an exile, anything but what he actually is. Indeed, she seems really to believe in his innocence, while he paused and looked up at his sister Carrie, who had entered the room. While we, he went on, slowly and sadly, taking his new ally softly by the hand, know only too well that the unhappy boy was in every respect guilty of the crime for which his father exiled him. But that is neither here nor there. The dreadful subject before us is not what he once did, but whether his being here to-night has had anything to do with my father's death. I cannot think he has, and yet—" The subtle inflection of his voice spoke volumes. This great actor had evidently been driven to bay. "Oh, Hartley!" came in a terrified cry from his sister. "What is this? You cannot they cannot think Joe could do anything so dreadful as that?" While over the face of Edith passed a look of despair, as she saw the countenance of the doctor slowly fill with the gloom of suspicion, and even the faithful Uncle Joe turn away as if he too had been touched by the blight of a secret doubt. "Ah, but I wish Joe were here himself," she cried with startling emphasis. "He should speak, even if it brought ruin amongst us." But the doctor was a man not to be moved by so simple a thing as a woman's unreasoning emotion. "Yes, the Yellow Domino would be very welcome just now," he allowed, with grim decision. "That he is not here is the most damning fact of all," Hartley slowly observed. "He fled when he saw our father fall." "But he shall come back," Edith vehemently declared. "If he does I shall need no further proof of his innocence," said Uncle Joe. "Nor I, so that he comes to-night," returned the doctor. "Then be satisfied, for here he is," I exclaimed from my retreat, and drawing back the mask over my face, and hastily enveloping myself in the Yellow Domino, I stepped forth into full view of the crowd around the table. Chapter 5. Part 1 of Chapter 5 of XYZ, a detective story by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Part 1 of Chapter 5, The Yellow Domino. A mingled sound of shrieks and exclamations greeted me. "Joe!" cried Edith, bounding forward. But I waved her back, and turned with a severe gesture toward Hartley Benson. What are your reasons," I demanded, "for thinking the poisoning that has taken place here was the work of the Yellow Domino?" "Do you ask me?" he retorted, after a moment's pause, during which my voice echoed through the room, waking strange gleams of doubt on the faces of more than one person present. "You wish to dare me, then?" he hissed, coming a step nearer. "I wish to know what the Yellow Domino has done that you or any one should consider him as responsible for the tragedy that has taken place," I steadily replied. "Are you not my brother, then?" he cried, in mingled rage and anxiety. "Was it not you I met under the evergreens and supplied with the Yellow Domino, in order to give you the opportunity of seeing our father to night and effecting the reconciliation which you had so long desired? Are you not he who afterward followed me to this room and hid himself in the closet from which you have just come, all for the purpose, as you said, of throwing yourself at your father's feet and begging pardon for a past of which you had long ago repented? Or are you some reckless buffoon who has presumed to step into the domino my brother left behind him, and careless of the terrible trouble that has overwhelmed this family, come here with your criminal jests to puzzle and alarm us?" "I am the man whom you gave the domino, if that is what you wish to know, Hartley Benson, and I am the man whom you led into the ambush of this closet, for such reasons as your own conscience must inform you. If the Yellow Domino put poison into Mr. Benson's wine, then upon me must lie the burden of the consequences, for I alone have worn the disguise of this mask from the moment we met under the evergreens till now, as I think may be proved by this gentleman you call Uncle Joe, and this lady you address as Edith." This mode of attack had the desired effect. "Who are you?" burst from Hartley's lips, now blanched to the color of clay. "Unmask him, doctor. Let us see the man who dares to play us tricks on such a night as this." "Wait!" cried I, motioning back not only the doctor, but Uncle Joe and the ladies, the whole group having started forward at Hartley's words. "Let us first make sure I am the Yellow Domino who has been paraded through the parlors this evening. Miss Benson, will you pardon me if I presume to ask you what were the words of salutation with which you greeted me to night?" "Oh!" she cried, in a tremble of doubt and dismay. "I do not know as I can remember. Something about being glad to see you, I believe, and my hope that your plans for the evening might succeed." "To which," said I made no audible reply, but pressed your hand in mine, with the certainty you were a friend, though you had not used the word counterfeit. "Yes, yes," she returned, blushing and wildly disturbed, as she had reason to be. "And you, Uncle Joe," I went on, "what were your words? How did you greet the man you had been told was your erring nephew?" I said, "To counterfeit wrong when one is right necessarily opens one to a misunderstanding." To which ambiguous phrase I answered, as you will remember, with a simple "That is true," a reply, by the way, that seemed to arouse your curiosity, and led to strange revelations. "God defend us!" cried Uncle Joe. The exclamation was enough. I turned to the trembling Edith. "I shall not attempt," said I, "to repeat or ask you to repeat any conversation which may have passed between us, for you will remember it was too quickly interrupted by Mr. Benson for us to succeed in uttering more than a dozen or so words. However, you will do me the kindness to acknowledge your belief that I am the man who stood with you behind the parlor curtains an hour ago." "I will," she replied, with a haughty lift of her head that spoke more loudly than her blushes. "It only remains, then, for Mr. Benson to assure himself I am the person who followed him to the closet. I know of no better way of his doing so than to ask him if he remembers the injunctions which he was pleased to give me when he bestowed upon me this domino." "No, that is, whatever they were given to the man I supposed to be my brother." "Ha, then, if it was your brother," I rejoined, "you gave that hint about the glass I would find on the library table, saying that if it did not smell of wine, I would know your father had not had his nightly potion, and would yet come to the library to drink it. An intimation, as all will acknowledge, which could have but the one result of leading me to go to the table and take up the glass and look into it in the suspicious manner which has been reported to you." He was caught in his own toils and saw it. Muttering a deep curse, he drew back, while a startled "Huh!" broke from the doctor, followed by a quick "Is that true? Did you tell him that, Mr. Benson?" For reply the now thoroughly alarmed villain leaped at my throat. "Off with that toggery! Let us see your face. I shall and will know who you are." But I resisted for another moment while I added: "It is, then, established to your satisfaction that I am really the man who has worn the yellow domino this evening. Very well. Now look at me, one and all, and say if you think I am likely to be a person to destroy Mr. Benson." And with a quick gesture I threw aside my mask, and yielded the fatal yellow domino to the impatient hands of Mr. Hartley Benson. The result was a cry of astonishment from those to whom the face thus revealed was a strange one, and a curse deep and loud from him to whom the shock of that moment's surprise must have been nearly overwhelming. "Villain!" he shrieked, losing his self-possession in a sudden burst of fury. "Spy! Informer! I understand it all now. You have been set over me by my brother. Instructed by him, you have dared to enter this house, worm yourself into its secrets, and by a deviltry only equalled by your presumption, taken advantage of your position to poison my father and fling the dreadful consequences of your crime in the faces of his mourning family. It was a plot well laid. But it is foiled, sir, foiled, as you will see when I have you committed to prison to morrow." "Mr. Benson," I returned, shaking him loose as I would a feather, "this is all very well, but in your haste and surprise you have made a slight mistake. You call me a spy. So I am, but a spy backed by the United States Government is not a man to be put lightly into prison. I am a detective, sir, connected at present with the Secret Service at Washington. My business is to ferret out crime and recognize a rogue under any disguise and in the exercise of any vile or deceptive practices." And I looked him steadily in the face. Then indeed his cheek turned livid, and the eye which had hitherto preserved its steadiness sought the floor. "A detective," murmured Miss Carrie, shrinking back from the cringing form of the brother whom, but a few hours before, she had deemed everything that was noble and kind. "A detective," echoed Edith, brightening like a rose in the sunshine. "In government employ," repeated Uncle Joe, honoring me with a stare that was almost comic in its mingled awe and surprise. "Yes," I rejoined. "If any one doubts me, I have papers with me to establish my identity. By what means I find myself in this place, a witness of Mr. Benson's death, and the repository of certain family secrets, it is not necessary for me to inform you. It is enough that I am here, have been here for a good hour, posted behind that curtain, that I heard Jonas's exclamation as he withdrew from the balcony, saw Mr. Benson come in from his bedroom, drink his glass of wine, and afterward fall at the feet of his son and daughter, and that having been here, and the witness of all this, I can swear that if Mr. Benson drank poison from yonder decanter, he drank poison that was put into it before either he or the yellow domino entered this room. Who put it there, it is for you to determine. My duty is done for to-night." And with a bow I withdrew from the group about me and crossed to the door. But Miss Carrie's voice, rising in mingled shame and appeal, stopped me. "Don't go," said she. "Not at least until you tell me where my brother Joseph is. Is he in this town, or has he planned this deception from a distance? I I am an orphan, sir, who at one blow has lost not only a dearly beloved father, but, as I fear, a brother too, in whom, up to this hour, I have had every confidence. Tell me, then, if any support is left for a most unhappy girl, or whether I must give up all hopes of even my brother Joe's sympathy and protection." "Your brother Joe," I replied, "has had nothing to do with my appearance here. He and I are perfect strangers, but if he is a tall, broad shouldered young man, shaped something like myself, but with a ruddy cheek and light curling hair, I can tell you I saw such a person enter the shrubbery at the southwest corner of the garden an hour or so ago." End of chapter 5, part 1. Part 2 of Chapter 5 of XYZ, a detective story by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Part 2 of Chapter 5. The Yellow Domino. "No, he is here," came in startling accents over my shoulders, and with a quick leap Joe Benson sprang by me and stood handsome, tall, and commanding in the center of the room. "Hartley, Carrie, Edith, what is this I hear? My father stricken down, my father dying or dead, and I left to wander up and down through the shrubbery while you knelt at his bedside and received his parting blessing. Is this the recompense you promised me, Hartley? Is this your sisterly devotion, Carrie? This your love and attention to my interests, Edith?" "Oh, Joe, dear Joe, do not blame us," Carrie made haste to reply. "We thought you were here. A man was here, that man behind you simulating you in every regard, and to him we gave the domino, and from him we have learned—" "What?" sprang in thundering tones from the young giant's throat as he wheeled on his heel and confronted me. "That your brother Hartley is a villain," I declared, looking him steadily in the eye. "God!" was his only exclamation as he turned slowly back and glanced toward his trembling brother. "Sir," said I, taking a step toward Uncle Joe, who, between his eagerness to embrace the newcomer and his dread of the consequences of this unexpected meeting, stood oscillating from one side to the other in a manner ridiculous enough to see, "what do you think of the propriety of uttering aloud and here the suspicions which you were good enough to whisper into my ears an hour ago? Do you see any reason of altering your opinion as to which of the two sons of Mr. Benson invaded his desk and appropriated the bonds afterward found in their common apartment, when you survey the downfallen crest of the one and compare it with the unfaltering look of the other?" "No," he returned, roused into sudden energy by the start given by Hartley; and advancing between the brothers, he looked first at one and then at the other with a long, solemn gaze that called out the color on Hartley's pale cheek and made the crest of Joe rise still higher in manly pride and assertion. "Joe," said he, "for 3 years now your life has lain under a shadow. Accused by your father of a dreadful crime, you have resolutely refused to exonerate yourself, notwithstanding the fact that a dear young girl waited patiently for the establishment of your innocence in order to marry you. To your family this silence meant guilt, but to me and mine it has told only a tale of self renunciation and devotion. Joe, Was I right in this? Was Edith right? The father you so loved, and feared to grieve, is dead. Speak, then. Did you or did you not take the bonds that were found in the cupboard at the head of your bed 3 years ago to-night? The future welfare, not only of this faithful child, but of the helpless sister, who, despite her belief in your guilt, has clung to you with unwavering devotion, depends upon your reply." "Let my brother speak," was the young man's answer, given in a steady and nobly restrained tone. "Your brother will not speak," his uncle returned. "Don't you see you must answer for yourself? Say, then, are you the guilty man your father thought you, or are you not? Let us hear, Joe." "I am not," avowed the young man, bowing his head in a sort of noble shame that must have sent a pang of anguish through the heart of his brother. "Oh, I knew it, I knew it!" came from Edith's lips in a joyous cry, as she bounded to his side and seized him by one hand, just as his sister grasped the other in a burst of shame and contrition that showed how far she was removed from any participation in the evil machinations of her elder brother. The sight seemed to goad Hartley Benson to madness. Looking from one to the other, he uttered a cry that yet rings in my memory. "Carrie, Edith, do you both forsake me, and all because of a word which any villain might have uttered? Is this the truth and constancy of women? Is this what I had a right to expect from a sister, a friend? Carrie, you at least always gave me your trust. Will you take it away because a juggling spy and a recreant brother have combined to destroy me?" But beyond a wistful look and a solemn shake of the head, Carrie made no response, while Edith, with her eyes fixed on the agitated countenance of her lover, did not even seem to hear the words of pleading that were addressed to her. The shock of the disappointment was too much for Hartley Benson. Clenching his hand upon his breast, he gave one groan of anguish and despair, and sank into a chair, inert and helpless. But before we could any of us take a step toward him, before the eyes of the doctor and mine could meet in mutual understanding, he had bounded again to his feet, and in a burst of desperation seized the chair in which he sat, and held it high above his head. "Fools, dotards!" he exclaimed, his eyes rolling in frenzy from face to face, but lingering longest on mine, as if there he read the true secrets of his overthrow, as well as the promise of his future doom. "You think it is all over with me, that there is nothing left for you to do but to stand still and watch how I take my defeat. But I am a man who never acknowledges defeat. There is still a word I have to say that will make things a little more even between us. Listen for it, you. It will not be long in coming, and when you hear it, let my brother declare how much enjoyment he will ever get out of his victory." And whirling the chair about his head, he plunged through our midst into the hall without. For an instant we stood stupefied. Then Carrie Benson's voice rose in one long, thrilling cry, and with a bound she rushed towards the door. I put out my hand to stop her, but it was not necessary. Before she could cross the threshold, the sudden, sharp detonation of a pistol shot was heard in the hall, and we knew that the last dreadful word of that night's tragedy had been spoken. The true secret of Hartley Benson's action in this matter was never discovered. That he planned his father's violent death, no one who was present at the above interview ever doubted. That he went further than that, and laid his plans in such a manner that the blame, if blame ensued, should fall upon his innocent brother, was equally plain, especially after the acknowledgment we received from Jonas that he went out on the balcony and looked in the window at the special instigation of his young master. But why this arch villain, either at his own risk or at that of the man he hated, felt himself driven to such a revolting crime, will never be known. unless, indeed, the solution be found in his undoubted passion for the beautiful Edith, and in the accumulated pressure of certain secret debts for whose liquidation he dared not apply to his father. I never revealed to this family the true nature of the motives which actuated me in my performance of the part I played that fatal night. It was supposed by Miss Carrie and the rest that I was but obeying instructions given me by Mr. Benson, and I never undeceived them. I was too much ashamed of the curiosity which was the mainspring of my action to publish each and every particular of my conduct abroad, though I could not but congratulate myself upon its results when, some time afterward, I read of the marriage of Joe and Edith. The counterfeiters were discovered and taken, but not by me. Finis. End of Part 2 of Chapter 5. End of XYZ, a detective story by Anna Katharine Green. Thank you for listening.